Good morning, everyone. We'll just start some introductions while you're waiting. Firstly, I want to mention that we have at least RFDS, Harvey and Bonington online. So when question time comes up, we have to repeat the questions into the mic so they can listen to that as well. Other announcement for this particular group is the Australasian Trauma Society meeting is in Perth, October 5th, 6th, 7th. Workshops on October 4th. Please log on to the website Trauma 2018. It's not often that the national meeting is held in Perth. It's combined with Royal Perth this year, so please support with your attendance. This morning we're going to hear about a long-awaited topic that we think we've addressed part of the question as part of that presentation about the world's first randomized controlled trial into prophylactic use of IVC filters. Dr. K.M. Ho is one of our prolific researchers in the intensive care unit and a keen participant in the trauma service in this hospital, is going to cover the whole spectrum of prevention of pulmonary emboli. So I'll hand over to him and we'll have questions at the end. Thanks, Dr. Ho. Do you have to press anything to record?
No, I think you can start. Thank you for your kind introduction, Sulaka. And it's a great privilege to have you guys with me today and to share what I learned in the last 10 years and most important, the results of the Da Vinci trial. We all worked very hard to try to complete the trial in the last 2.5 years. Let's see how it works here. All right, just have some personal disclosures. And I'm primarily funded by the Ring Medical Research Foundation. And I give advice to the Cardinal Health regarding deep vein thrombosis, and I received competitive research grants from Haemonetics. First of all, we need to know about the significance of venous thromboembolism. It accounts for about 7.4 per 10,000 population per year in Australia. It's up to 7% of all deaths in Australian hospitals are related to venous thromboembolism. When we look at the Australian New Zealand Intensive Care Society Centre of Research and Evaluation, about 1% of all emergency intensive care admissions were related to acute pulmonary embolism. And unfortunately, as you can see, 20% of them actually, over 20% of them require mechanical ventilation, and 4.2% had a cardiac arrest prior to admitting to the intensive care. And as you can expect, the mortality was extremely high, about 15%. The fundamental question I've been asked many times by my colleagues as well as junior staff is, do we have patients die with pulmonary embolism or they die from pulmonary embolism? It is an important question we have to ask before we go into the details of this, this particular topic, because if they die with pulmonary embolism, that means it is inevitable. But if it is die from pulmonary embolism, that means it's preventable. Now, there are many reasons we want to believe that the patients may actually die with pulmonary embolism rather than the other way around. And I'll give you just a few to warm you up. The first reason is based on the advice of the House of God. If you have read this book, or you haven't, I would recommend you to read it, is because the recommendation is delivering of good medical care is to do as much nothing as possible. The second reason is bipolar, and you can say that don't waste your time with explanations. People only hear what they want to believe or want to hear. And the third and most important, this is an interesting one, is in doubt we should actually just blame our patients. Just like this surgeon who wants to move the clinic to the operating room because he said too much consciousness actually slowing him down his clinic. On the other hand, if we really believe in the literature, patient can die from pulmonary embolism. There are plenty of studies to support it. Then there is a problem for us because it opens a can of worms. First of all, we may feel guilt if a patient dies from pulmonary embolism. We may feel shame in the M&M meeting. And we have to reflect and research and change in practice. And for those who are involved in administrations, we have to implement changes in the system to prevent that. Now, because I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm just going to concentrate on the last two bits of it in my talk. We all have been told how medical errors or mistakes or mishaps can happen in the healthcare system, according to this sweet cheese model, which means that the errors, the fatal one in particular one, they are not happening just because of one error, but multiple errors when they're aligned together. But the difficulty for fatal pulmonary embolism is the hosts vary between different patients and systems, and they can change even within the same patient over time. This is one of the latest studies of local Australian data showing that basically the incidence of VTE is still increasing in the last 15 years. And the more important thing is there is wide variation between hospital and within hospital, having different types and incidence of VTE, suggesting that there's potential interventions that we can do to improve the situation. Now, if you look at all the causes of venous thromboembolism, in particular fatal pulmonary embolisms, it basically boils down to three major areas that we want to look at it carefully this morning. The first thing is failure to prevent, the second is failure to diagnose, and the third one obviously is failure to treat. And the venous thromboembolism, in terms of IVC filter, we're talking about predominantly in the first one, but I'll come back to that in the second part of my talk. But the first thing I want to talk about is how we can maximize prevention. Now, mechanical prophylaxis is definitely better than no prophylaxis. We have quite good randomized control trial looking at stroke patients with a without intermittent pneumatic compression, as well as systematic review. They're looking at multiple studies suggestive of mechanical prophylaxis is definitely better than TEDs in terms of the pneumatic compression, as well as better than no prophylaxis. This is not surprising because if you remember the real cost trial of these three areas, hypercoagulability, vascular damage, and circulatory status, it's definitely tackling this bit that anticoagulant is not tackling. The second thing I want to talk about maximize prevention is very often I've been asked, if the patient has deranged coagulation, should we still consider the patient have risk of thrombosis? I can almost convince, hopefully I can convince you this morning that they are actually not immune from the risk of venous thromboembolism. This is a study we done about 5 years ago now, 2013. We looked at about 1,000 patients in Perth, presented to the emergency department with symptoms and signs comparable with pulmonary embolism, and look at whether the coagulation profile, including the platelets, RNR, APTD, fibrinogen, whether they were predictive of any types of pulmonary embolism, bilateral pulmonary embolism, or settled pulmonary embolism. And as you can see, we have about 150 pulmonary embolisms out of 1,000 patients. And none of these derangement in coagulation parameters were actually sensitive enough to exclude someone with pulmonary embolism. So basically, if you have symptoms of pulmonary embolism, even if your coagulations parameters are deranged, it should not exclude pulmonary embolism automatically. Now, why is that so? We looked into this in more detail. Why INR and APTD does not tell you the whole story about clots and bleeding. We look at a group of patients in the critical care unit with deranged coagulation. And then we look at their thromboelastograph, which is an in vitro measurement of the whole blood formation of clots. And those with, we call hypercoagulability, which means that the maximum amplitude of the clot strength is increased. They're much particularly high risk of developing subsequent venous thromboembolism, despite they have an abnormal coagulation. So these are important in our daily management, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And the details probably is described in one of the review I written last year. And the third thing you want to maximize prevention is to understand the drugs we use to prevent venous thromboembolism. We always use, almost in this hospital, unfortunately, they happen sometimes no molecular heparin and enoxaparin. They're actually probably safer than you think, as well as you can argue less effective than you think. Now, this is just one of the two studies that published within the last 5 years, looking at antithrombin-free level in surgical patients and trauma patients. As you can see, the proportion of patients with normal antithrombin within the first 5 to 6 days is actually relatively low. When you have antithrombin-free deficient, both these drugs will not actually work or not as effective as you expect. Then we move on to how we try to diagnose pulmonary embolism and to prevent fatal pulmonary embolism. If we look at postmortem studies, most of them will report about 1/3 to 2/3 of the fatal pulmonary embolism were not diagnosed before death. And why they were not diagnosed is probably due to multiple reasons. But one of the many reasons that I've been asked by many radiologists as well as my junior staff is whether the CTPA will induce contrast-induced nephropathy. Now, this is a study we published early this year. We look at, in the vertical axis, it's pulmonary embolism severity index, means the risk of dying from pulmonary embolism in patients with symptoms and signs compatible with pulmonary embolisms, requiring a CTPA. And at the same time, we calculate the contrast-induced nephropathy risk score, means how likely they will develop contrast-induced nephropathy, which defined is just an elevation in the creatinine, probably about 40 to 50 micromole per liter within 48 hours. As you can see, they both go up simultaneously, which means that if you have features that will develop contrast-induced nephropathy, you probably have features dying from pulmonary embolism as well if you have a pulmonary embolism. And this little corner here is the one that you have a high risk of contrast-induced nephropathy compared to dying from pulmonary embolism. As you can see, it's extremely rare for you to die from contrast-induced nephropathy compared to die from pulmonary embolism. So you can almost argue the benefits of a CTPA scans are almost always higher than risk of contrast-induced nephropathy for people with symptoms and signs compatible with pulmonary embolism require CTPA. So don't be shy to ask for it, and we will deal with the CIN if they happen. The third thing we want to talk about very briefly is the treatment of pulmonary embolism before we move on to the Da Vinci trial. There are many ways to treat pulmonary embolism to prevent patients dying from pulmonary embolism. You can anticoagulate them with different drugs, we can break them, we can bypass them, we can lyse them, we can remove them, or we can suck them. There's so many different options that basically, there are probably I would say too many. The more important thing is we probably need to protocolize it, because you do not want to make 10 phone calls to make a decision what to do in a patient with hemodynamic instability with pulmonary embolism. So you probably should protocolize it with a multidisciplinary agreement and local expertise within your hospital or the institution or the catchment area of the healthcare service. And everyone should speak on the same page, and rather than discussing and arguing on an individual basis each time. Now, this is one of the protocols published in one of the other papers, and that people recommended to do is give heparin if possible. If they have a cardiac arrest, then you go on to the VA ECMO, which unfortunately we still don't have it here, that we need to retrieve for VA ECMO. And if there's no cardiac arrest, then you consider whether they have contraindication to thrombolysis, and if they don't have it, then you can thrombolize them. If they have, then you should go to embolectomy. And again, we need to have a protocol for that, hopefully within the next 12 months or so in this hospital. Just want to go into a little bit of detail of the treatment of pulmonary embolism for the junior staff. You can literally use any drugs you like, depends on really the hemodynamic status of the patient, body weight, and bleeding risk. In general, the higher risk patients, we will prefer unfractionated heparin and tightly monitored ABTT. Try to aim at a high ABTT, especially for the first 24 hours. I'm not so worried about the bleeding, even at running an ABTT of 90 to 120. Most of our cardiac surgical patients will have an unmeasurable high ABTT during the few hours of operation, and they don't die from a cerebral hemorrhage from that, not frequently at least. Because if you don't treat them adequately in the first 24 hours, you're going to deal with the problems that are more bleeding, like embolectomy or thrombolysis. Bear in mind, unfractionated heparin at the dose we use is about 90 minutes half-life, and so you do need to monitor it a little bit more closely, especially after a bolus. In terms of thrombolysis, it's very controversial. Meta-analysis published in JAMA showing that there's an improvement in mortality if you lyse them, and overall, but the number needed to treat is large. And at the same time, major bleeding, including intracranial hemorrhage, can happen significantly more after thrombolysis. So I'm not too sure where the line on the sand will draw in terms of when we use thrombolysis, but I certainly wouldn't use it lightly unless they're on decent dose of inotropes or deteriorating despite anticoagulation. Now we're all probably waiting to talk about the elephant in the room. When all hell breaks loose, the hell will be empty. Now people say that in the United States it can't happen there. But in our workplace, we know that it happens all the time, and I'm sure Sridhar will see this much more often than I do. And not only the blood on the floor, but the blood inside the patients can be quite dramatic, like this one with intracranial hemorrhage and contusion, severe liver contusions there. And this type of patients is the one that we're really worrying about in the DVC trial. Because not only bleeding we're worrying about, there is another nuisance that we're dealing with, which means the thrombosis. These are contraindications, like I talked about earlier, not because the coagulation parameters are abnormal, but clinically there's such a high risk to have bleeding in terms of anticoagulation that they can actually die from the anticoagulant. In this situation, we're really between the rock and the hard place. Now, when we are not uncertain what to do, the commercial company usually will offer a solution to us, and in this case, actually multiple solutions. You can see different types of IVC filters that in the market. FDA issued a serious warning about the side effects of filter because many of them were not removed in previous studies in many centers. And in some centers, up to 85% of the patients were not having the retrievable filters removed. And that contributed to some serious, infrequent, serious complications that leading to some lawsuits. This is one of the slides showing you how complication can happen if the filters actually perforated through the IVC there. And it's going to be difficult. This is one of the latest studies published in Annals of Vascular Surgery and showing the difficulty the American colleagues are facing over there. The title of the paper is IVC Filters Malpractice Litigations, and damn if you do it, damn if you don't. I will explain to you why. This is the amount of money median award for the claims. It's just a little over $1 million United States dollars. And this looks like there's a trend towards a little bit increasing in terms of the claims. The details are more important. If you look at it, denial or delay means not using IVC filter for primary prophylaxis account for about 1/3 of the litigation success in terms of claims. At the same time, failure to diagnose or treat the complications related to IVC filter also account for about 24%. So that's why if you do it, you can potentially be sued. If you don't do it, you can still be sued in the United States. But increasing use of retrievable IVC filter is a phenomenon that has been observed in particular in the United States. And you can see because of the retrievable filter seems giving you a solution that you can just use for a short period of time and take it out and you walk it up. And estimated in 2012, it's about $300 billion in the United States alone spent on IVC filters. And in part due to the controversial and conflicting recommendations by different professional bodies, you can see the Eastern Association for the Surgeons of Trauma is strongly recommending using the filter in patients with contraindication to anticoagulants to prevent pulmonary embolism and fatal pulmonary embolism. Whereas the College of Physicians said there's no role whatsoever. And the radiology college is just sitting on the fence and saying that we're not too sure what to do. We have to wait for more evidence. There's probably some benefit, but they're not too sure who will actually get it. If you look at the latest systematic review published in JAMA Surgery 2 years ago, I was so surprised at the conclusion saying that more observational studies are needed. Are we serious about it? We believe that probably the best way to resolve the controversy and the problem is through a randomized controlled trial with economic analysis. And then we started the DVC trial about 3 years ago now. We published our protocol in BMJ Open last year, where we are about 80% or 75% enrollment. And so everything's transparent. The trial is involving many institutions for their academic input as well as patient recruitment. And I'm pleased that we have completed enrollment within 2.5 years. The study was purely funded by the Medical Research Foundation of this hospital, Wing Medical Research Foundation, as well as the STRAC grant from the WA Health. And we were completely independent of any IVC filter manufacturing companies. There's some justification for the filter and in this study because we know that DVT, as we talk about, is common, and not only that about 3 to 5% are complicated by pulmonary embolism, and the fatality rate for pulmonary embolism in this sort of situation is extremely high, about 50%. In fact, have been reported fatal pulmonary embolism is the third leading cause of death in patients who survive the first 24 hours after major trauma. So we involved 4 tertiary centers in Australia in the last 2.5 years, and recruiting only adult patients with severe trauma. By definition, injury severity score estimated to be at least over 15, with a contraindication to anticoagulant prophylaxis within the first 72 hours of trauma admission, without the following exclusion criteria, like imminent death, or they can be started on anticoagulant within 72 hours, or they already have pulmonary embolism on admission. And obviously, if they are normally treated with a systemic anticoagulant, that they should not be gone to the trial, and then independent patients were excluded. These are the results that we are going to present to you. We screened about over 1,700 patients with severe trauma within that study period, and we enrolled our target enrollment 240 and randomized them into 2 groups. 122 allocated to the filter within 72 hours, and all of them got their filter except 1, and because we judged that except 2, and 1 declined after the consent for the enrollment, and 1 actually judged to be too good to have the filter and will be starting anticoagulant very quickly. And there are 118 being allocated to control, and again, 2 of them have a so-called protocol violation and put in by condition by 1, and then 1 have been swapped over because of pulmonary embolism developed subsequently and cannot be anticoagulated. We use a centralized web-based randomization service to ensure adequate allocation concealment. Blinding was deemed to be inadvisable, impossible, because we don't want to lose the filter or loss to follow-up. And to minimize the PE detection bias, our CT pulmonary angiogram was mandatory if one of those following criteria were met, and including hypotension, chest pain, or hypoxia. And all patients in either arm of the study will be having ultrasound lower limbs to exclude deep thrombosis to reduce the risk of pulmonary embolism. The primary outcome was a composite outcome of mortality or symptomatic PE within 90 days of injury, and then a priori secondary outcome including symptomatic PE in patients who did not receive any anticoagulant within 7 days of trauma, and complications related to the IVC filter, 90-day mortality, lower limb deepening thrombosis, and risk of bleeding. This is the most important slide. If you look at the primary composite outcome, death or symptomatic PE over 90 days, there was absolutely no difference between the 2 groups, and the median filter time left in the patients was about 24 days. However, if you look at the secondary outcome for those who could not receive prophylactic anticoagulant because of the severe injury, there were literally no pulmonary embolism, symptomatic pulmonary embolism in those who are assigned to the or allocated to the filter group, compared to those who were allocated to the control group. And within this group, there was 1 fatal pulmonary embolism. We try to adjust for competing risks on the death on the advice of the statistician, and again, the results remain significantly different between the 2 groups in terms of symptomatic PE for those who could not receive anticoagulant within 7 days. As I mentioned before, there was 1 fatal pulmonary embolism confirmed on postmortem in control group, but overall 90-day mortality, major bleeding or minor bleeding were similar between the 2 groups. We also could not confirm some of the worries that people talking about using the filter with a lower limb deepening thrombosis that increased with IVC filter, and the 2 groups were extremely similar in terms of incidence of DVT. That's probably in part we advise people to start the anticoagulant as soon as possible and remove the filter as soon as possible. So our study results overall is the largest multi-center study specifically evaluating the prophylactic IVC filter to prevent symptomatic PE in severely injured patients with contraindication to anticoagulant. And we could not confirm that would be beneficial for the composite outcome of 90-day mortality of symptomatic PE. But for those who could not have anticoagulant within 7 days, IVC filter early use was able to substantially reduce symptomatic PE without increasing lower limb deepening thrombosis. This is meaningful from our perspective, the secondary outcome, because the group of patients we are able to avoid systemic anticoagulant, which they will have the highest bleeding risk, and the number needed to treat was about 7. And when we look at the data as well as the literature, this group of patients who could not have anticoagulants within 7 days are predominantly those with severe traumatic brain injury with cerebral contusion, and where they were actually subject to a lot of surgical procedure within the first week and with a high intracranial pressure. And so we suspect this will be the group of patients that potentially early IVC filter may be beneficial for these patients if you want to prevent use of systemic anticoagulant for pulmonary embolism later on down the track. This study has some limitations, and it's designed in a way to detect a sizable protective effect because we believe it's an expensive device and an invasive device. If it doesn't offer a sizable protective effect, it's probably not going to be cost effective. And so we cannot exclude the study was a bit underpowered to detect a smaller difference in the primary outcome. And due to the safety concern, there was no blinding was used in this study. However, the mandatory CT scan, the rates between the two groups were similar and suggested that the results were not biased by the lack of blinding. So in summary, early prophylactic IVC filter used to be reserved for only a selected subgroup of patients, major trauma with a prolonged contraindications to prophylactic anticoagulant after injury. And this finding has significant implications for trauma management, especially patients with severe neurotrauma. So if you really want to remember one thing, the IVC filter certainly is not the panacea. And our results certainly will set a slightly higher bar for using IVC filter for primary prophylaxis in the future. So in summary, a multimodal approach to maximize prevention is important to prevent fatal pulmonary embolism. Don't rely on INR or ABDT alone to guide anticoagulant prophylaxis, and don't be shy to use a CDPA to exclude PE when patients are suspected of pulmonary embolism. Aggressive heparinization initially is important. Protocolize advanced therapies before it happens. And IVC filter should be reserved for really those with contraindication for more than 7 days to anticoagulants. And before I finish, I just remind you there's an update on the laws of House of God. And the delivery of good medical care is to give patients greasy, delicious food, whatever they want from Google research, and no prophylaxis. A multimodal approach is needed to prevent fatal PE, but following the laws of House of God is not part of it. I thank you for your attention, and this is my email address if you want the slide request. And I'd like to thank all my collaborators and all the investigators here, and I apologize if your name is not specifically mentioned in this acknowledgement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ho, for one brilliant study that the world's been waiting for, and also for your lovely summary of the situation and the clinical picture that we need to keep in mind. While we're waiting for people to put their hand up, can I ask you about the safety side of your study? Look at complications of filters, and how long did you watch them for, and are they all out?
Yeah, we have put it all in the supplementary file in the manuscript that we submitted for publication, which is, as I explained to some people, in the third round of peer review within a journal. It's like the quarterfinal. By the English team, and in this shortcut. So within the next 2 weeks we will know, and hopefully it will come out and you can look at it very carefully. And we described the side effects or complications of the filter quite carefully in the study, both in the main paper as well as the supplementary file. There was no significant complication almost in all patients who used the filter except one. That the filter was left there about 118 days, as far as I could remember, and we had trouble to remove it radiologically at the end. We had to ask the surgeon to remove it through an open approach. And otherwise, all filters were intact when examined by the medical physics, and some of them with clots require systemic anticoagulation before they could be removed. And interestingly, the number of filters with clots when they tried to remove it, and with clots are actually quite similar to the number of pulmonary embolism we prevented. So it's very suggestive actually they really got the clot trapped in the filter, and rather than the de novo inducing clot by itself.
All right. Anyone from?
Ken, I'm very interested in whether you've had a chance to look at or comment on the other subgroup of interest, which is spinal cord injury. We obviously get quite a lot of concerns from the spinal surgeons with regards to epidural hematomas and cord hematomas, and the expansion of that might be detrimental to the patients, and whether that subgroup of patients had any significant signal from your study.
It's an important question, but I'm afraid to tell you it will be underpowered to answer that question confidently. And as far as I know, TBI was the main bulk of the patients that could not be anticoagulated within the first 7 days. And then the second major group would be spinal injury patients. As you can see, the traumatic brain injury constitute about 70% of them already. So I cannot confidently say that filter will be useful for them, but my view, if you ask me clinically, not based on the study, will be if the spinal surgeon really strongly believe they can't have anticoagulant within 7 days, they should have the filter.
Dr. Hannibal?
So quite, this is a landmark study. Is it going to make it more popular or less popular?
So the question from the floor, Dr. Hannibal, was landmark studies are going to change Dr. Hill's immense popularity that he already has.
So just to clarify, I mean, amongst neurosurgeons and lawyers.
Amongst neurosurgeons and lawyers.
I probably need to change now and maybe ask a plastic surgeon to change my face, and I'll be safe. But I think when I presented the results in the United States last month in the annual meeting of the Shock Society, it was well received. They think that we definitely need that study, and it is not able to answer all the questions, but it certainly draw the line on the sand much better than before.
I would have thought that everyone would be happy that you brought some clarity to the discussion.
Maybe
I can't imagine.
maybe not the company, not the RBC filter company.
I would have thought it does support the use of RBC filter. It brings clarity to the whole thing.
It will be smaller subgroup of patients.
Smaller subgroup of patients, true. Any other questions? Dr. Hernandez? Sorry, Jenny.
There was one other thing that we found in the study, certainly in the early days, and that is that IVC filters, although it's protective when they're unable to have anticoagulation therapy, it doesn't preclude the need for anticoagulation therapy to start as soon as possible. And that was one of the misunderstandings that happened early on in the study. So once they have a filter in, as soon as they're able to start anticoagulation therapy, clinicians shouldn't just rely on the filter alone to prevent VTE.
Yes, so coming upon the floor is about the need to start anticoagulation early. And if you talk to vascular surgeons, it's not all about PE, it's about the DVT as well because of the long-term problems with venous ulcers and other changes from that. Can I ask you to comment on that 2014 BMJ paper, it's not your paper, the one that said there's an increasing incidence of venous thromboembolism and also variation between hospitals. Does that just reflect better detection rather than what's changing in our population or our practice to allow that particular segment that we've got an increasing incidence? It doesn't necessarily ring true.
It's always difficult because of the it's epidemiological study based on administrative data. So I agree with you. Probably that will be in part related to the way people are more aggressively trying to diagnose it. But the interesting thing is, even though you don't look at that particular study, if you look at the New South Wales Department of Health report published in 2016 for 2014 data, there were still about 18 fatal pulmonary embolism in New South Wales in 2014, which is still by far, I would say, too many.
If I can follow up with another question whilst I was thinking about it. Are there any other markers? You talked previously about the thromboelastogram or viscoelastic investigations. Did your patients have those as well? Were you able to look at whether the initial or takes of the, sorry to use a brand name take, you know what I'm talking about. Is there anything else predictive that we can use to identify these patients?
The short answer is no. The long answer is a bit complicated. Just look at fungal elastograph. It has a positive predictive value in terms of prophylactic. What it means is if it is increased, you certainly at a much higher risk of fungal embolism happening, despite your coagulation can be abnormal. Now, when you have a normal fungal elastograph, then you are like tossing a coin. You can still have venous fungal embolism, but then you're not as high risk. So it doesn't exclude you. So I would say if you have an abnormal coagulation profile and you have a hypercoagulant fungal elastograph, and if there's no clinical bleeding, I definitely will start them on anticoagulant prophylactically. If they have pro-bleeding fungal elastograph with abnormal coagulation, then my advice will be to hold off not to start the anticoagulant until at least the fungal elastograph is back to normal.
So you said if the coagulation is abnormal, but you have a hypercoagulable tail, you wouldn't?
I will start them on.
Yes, yep, okay.
Doctor, do you think that this landmark study, which we're all really proud of, is going to sort of, induce any major changes in the way we manage the traumatic group of patients in Warkworth Hospital, in the sense of having some fairly generalized recommendations, and maybe add to another page on our anticoagulation chart that we're now running?
The question was, is it going to change our management? Yeah, look, I guess ideally I should wait for the peer review process to go through and see what the rest of the world says, but I can't see how the rest of this organisation, Dr. Hannibal, sorry to put up his hand, I can't imagine how the rest of the sensible clinicians, which excludes some people, can avoid this particular result. Sorry, Dr. Hannibal, go ahead.
Of course it does. It must do. Someone comes in with a bad brain injury, I don't think they can have anticoagulation within 7 days. You put a filter in.
Oh, good. I wasn't sure what you were going to say. I guess the Hannibal supports it.
The other thing that's going to change practice, or has changed practice, we used to put these in like Smarties 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah, patients would come in and have a routine IVC filter because there was no complications. I've got 15, 20 patients with severe long-term complications because the filters weren't taken out. So this will change practice on numerous levels within this hospital and worldwide.
I'd like to invite someone from interventional radiology to speak up if they wish to. Dr. Anderson's here. No comment. Anything else there?
It's already changed.
Oh, sorry.
It's practice, the wheels have fallen off on the IVC request, which is a good thing. We're putting far fewer in, basically because we now have a firm handle on those who should be receiving them, and more importantly, those who should not. So it's very pleasing to see that since the Da Vinci trial ended, the number of requests for IVC filters has remarkably reduced.
Well, are you taking a lot more out?
Well, we always were. The problem was we're putting so many in that the percentage, we were running at high 80%, low 90% retrieval rates. So there are obviously a number lost, but when we were putting so many in, those became quite a significant number, as alluded to by the Carnival. And there are long-term complications of these things. We do have a follow-up system for them. I think all of the Da Vinci ones are certainly accounted for or removed with the one that required surgical. And now that we're putting fewer in, I expect to see, obviously, numerically fewer problems.
So just to summarise what Dr. Philbin said, is they are putting in less IVC filters. They've got a registry which follows them up, so hopefully most of them will get removed in the appropriate time as well. Any other comments? I have to say, certainly running a trial like that increases the baseline knowledge within the whole hospital amongst staff members of all sorts on the DVT complexes. It's just a byproduct of that particular trial.
Karen, I was going to ask, was there any standardisation of the specific device that was used in each patient, or was that left up to the interventional radiologist? And would you expect different complications from different devices?
Just to summarise the question for the telehealth people. The question was whether the IVC filters were standardised.
It was not standardized because we cannot mandate a particular type if they are not used to use it, both for insertion and retrieval. But having said that, I think we can tell you that it's over 99% of the filters were bark filter, Denali filters. And there's only probably a handful of Cook's filter, put in Fish and Charles Gardner Hospital and Brisbane, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like you to put your hands together for Dr. Horan.